Hello everyone, welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. My name is Rabia Aziz. I'll be using Macroeconomics 3rd Canadian edition by Krugman, Wells, and Parkinson. So that's the textbook we are officially using for this course. Today we're going to just outline what macroeconomics is and what are some of the key concerns for macroeconomists. So before I go there towards the actual content of our chapter, first I want to show you a few slides that I have taken from the web about the global impact of COVID-19. So beginning of the year, we were hit by the coronavirus and it had a huge impact on all of us. So we're working from home now, we're studying from home. Small things that we used to take for granted are no longer possible. But let's look at the economic impact of COVID-19. Over here we have all of these high income economies: South Korea, US, Germany, Canada, Italy, France. So this is data for the second quarter of 2020 and this is GDP growth rate. What is GDP? GDP is the level of production done by any given economy. And as you can see, all of these economies have actually seen major contractions in their production levels. For France, their production levels have actually declined by almost 14%, the highest among these group of countries at least. For China, it seems like a positive growth rate in the second quarter, but remember this is quarterly data and not yearly. Their yearly projections for GDP growth rate for 2020 are now as low as almost 1%. So huge impact in our production levels across the globe. Next, I have annualized data for our domestic economy, which is Canada, and you can see the GDP has contracted significantly. So huge dip at the beginning of the year, it kept becoming negative and went down to almost as low as 17 or 18%. Now, if you are not producing anything or your production levels are contracting massively, what happens to the number of workers hired? And you can see our employment statistic, this is again yearly percentage change, went down to almost as low as negative 15%. It's a huge contraction in the number of workers that are being hired. That has seen some recovery since April, but these numbers, as you can see, are still in the negative range. Next, I have data from the service industry, and this is for sales at full service restaurants. And you can see our service industry was hugely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and their sales went down by negative 80%. So a huge contraction in your service sector, a lot of job losses in this sector, a lot of small businesses have completely shut down, major contraction of this sector. So everyone associated with this particular sector would be more impacted than say people in the educational industry. I have now shifted to online teaching, but for now I still have my job. But it does create a lot of pessimism in our economy because we are very unsure about when will we come out of this, what does the future holds for us, and therefore people will be overall apprehensive about spending in this kind of environment. Now, why are we discussing all of this in our macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is very different from microeconomics. Micro looks at the individual firm's profits, the individual consumer's happiness or well-being. Whereas macroeconomics is the bigger picture. It's the bird's eye view of the economy. It looks at all of us together. How are all of us affected by the pandemic in terms of unemployment? What's happening to the inflation or changes in price levels in our economy? How do governments respond to this type of crisis? So macroeconomics is looking at the aggregate behavior of all individuals and firms. And then it gives us a holistic picture of how this aggregate behavior affects major macroeconomic variables like your production, employment, trade balances, etc. So let's define macroeconomics more formally. Macroeconomics examines the aggregate behavior of the economy. So it looks at the behavior of all individuals and all firms in our economy that will now produce some level of economic performance as a whole. A very common phenomena that we come across in macroeconomics is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, what do we mean by that? In layman's terms, this is simply saying that 2 plus 2 is no longer equal to 4. If we aggregate some behavior across all individuals, we will now not get 6. The actual number, or the impact in terms of my numerical example, might be a lot bigger. It might be 8, 10, etc. Impact of our individual behavior when we all do the same thing and the aggregate becomes much more powerful. And in order to understand this concept, let's take an example. And this is called the paradox of thrift. What if everyone becomes thrifty today? As I just detailed with the example of COVID pandemic, we are all pessimistic or we are all apprehensive about the future. We don't know what the future holds for us. So in terms of this pessimism, I will start spending less today. As I start spending less, firms will see a lower demand for the goods and services, so they don't need to produce as much. So they will reduce their production. Remember, GDP is your overall level of production of the economy, and I'm going to denote it throughout the course as Y. So with spending declining, we have lower production by firms. Now, if firms are not producing as much, they don't need to hire as many workers, and therefore unemployment increases. And this creates a chain or a ripple effect throughout the economy. If I have more unemployed workers, I have more households with less income, and therefore the households are now again going to reduce their spending. So it creates this now second cycle of lower spending, lower production, and even higher unemployment. If I sum up this effect on GDP over all these many iterations, as it will create this ripple effect, we will see that the overall impact in GDP, the aggregate impact in GDP, is much bigger than this initial decline in spending. And this is what we mean by the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. A major lesson over here is that your individual actions, when they summed up, will have a much bigger impact, and also the impact might have unintended consequences. So we all were becoming thrifty in order to save more, to have some more resources in the future. However, when all of us start to save more today, we have actually caused a major decline in economic activity, a major slump in our production cycle. And that is the unintended consequence of our aggregate behavior. And this doesn't always happen just for negative shocks. We can also see this happening for positive shocks to the economy. If everyone starts spending more today, firms have more demand for their goods, so they start producing more, they hire more workers, and therefore unemployment goes down. And that will now create a ripple effect or a chain effect in your economy in the positive direction, and the overall GDP will be much higher than the initial increase in spending. In macroeconomics, you'll often come across the term self-regulating economy. A self-regulating economy is one in which there is no government intervention. If we are going through a downward spiral, like the one I just explained, government is not going to step in, and the economy will correct itself through the invisible hand. We'll talk about this concept more when we look at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model in later chapters. But this is historically what macroeconomics was. There was no concern for these big downturns or upturns in economic activity because it was thought that they will just always correct themselves. Macroeconomics as an independent discipline of its own really came out after the experience of the Great Depression. So I'm talking about 1929, lasting for almost a decade into 1930s, and we saw GDP declining by almost 30%. Unemployment was soaring to 19%. Now, this is not just a 1 quarter or 2 quarter phenomenon. The Great Depression lasted for almost a decade. So we have a decade-long catastrophe, and there's no invisible hand working inside. So nothing seems to be getting better. And in fact, the economy was stuck in this continuous downward spiral with no end in sight. The one positive benefit of the Great Depression was that it forced economists and policymakers of the 1930s to recognize that there were major gaps in their understanding of how the economy works. And this recognition led to the development of this new subfield that we call macroeconomics. John Maynard Keynes, who is considered the father of macroeconomics, came up with this idea that governments need to intervene. We need to have government intervention in order to short-circuit this spiral. John Maynard Keynes, who is considered the father of macroeconomics, really propagated this idea that governments need to step in. And he said that economic slumps or downturns in economic activity are really caused because of inadequate spending. And the only way to come out of them is through government intervention. Government needs to step in and increase its spending. As government increase spending on major projects like highways, ports, LNG projects, etc., it will create jobs. And as it creates jobs, it will cause increase in production of goods and services. As the economy picks up, again creates a ripple effect in the economy, but now in the positive direction. Spending will gradually increase. People are spending more, creating even more demand for goods and services. More workers will be hired, and overall economy will start moving in the positive direction and come out of this big slump. Keynes was referring to what we now call expansionary fiscal policy. And we'll talk about these stabilization policies in a lot more detail as we progress through the course. Next, we'll talk about some major economic concerns for macroeconomists. The first one is our business cycle. Now, we did talk about the slump in economic activity. One major slump that we referred to was that of the Great Depression. And we started our lesson today with the example of the COVID-19 and how it has caused a global meltdown in terms of job losses and decline in economic activity. With downturns, there also come upturns. And in the short run, we often see that the economy oscillates between the two. So in the short run, there is an alternation between economic downturns followed by upturns. And this is a continuous cycle. A depression is when your economic downturn is particularly severe or very long. So the Great Depression lasted almost a decade. And in terms of its economic impact on our job losses and production levels was so huge, we call it the Great Depression. Any particular downturn is also referred to as what we call a recession. It will have your output and employment declining, and unemployment will always be moving in the opposite direction. So unemployment will be higher in an economic downturn or in a recession. Expansions are also called periods of recoveries or booms. So this is a time period when your economy is going in a positive spiral. We have higher production activity, we have more people being employed, and unemployment is going down. We can visualize these recessions and expansions that the economy experiences on a diagram where I have economic activity being captured by our production level or employment on the y-axis, and we have time period on the x-axis. And this could be yearly data or quarterly data, because remember, this is short-run alternations between upturns and downturns. When you have economy expanding, this is when GDP and employment are rising. It will keep on rising, reach a peak, and then turn into a downturn or a recession. So the point at which an economy changes from an expansion into a recession is called a business cycle peak, and the point at which the economy turns from a recession into a recovery or an expansion is called a business cycle trough. So you can see over longer time periods, we'll see many economic upturns and downturns over this time period. So periods of recessions are the ones highlighted in gray. So this is when your economy is slowing down, GDP is going down, employment data are going down. And this white area is our period of recovery or expansion when both employment and production levels are rising. Let's look at actual data for Canada to see, do we actually have these type of business cycles in our economy. So we have numbers for 1986 to 2016, and we have both the production levels in red and the employment levels in purple over here. So this is called time series data. And as you can see, both the production levels and my employment numbers are rising over here, and they start to dip down in these areas which are shaded as gray. So what's happening during this time period? This is your 2009 major financial crisis. It started in the US, spread all across the globe, and you can see both employment and your production levels dipped significantly down. This is absolute numbers in panel A. Whereas in panel B, I have the same statistics, but in terms of percentage changes. So this is annual percentage change from one year to the next. And this really clarifies the picture for us in terms of the impact of the financial crisis. You can see our production levels are almost negative 16%. So annual percentage change from one year to the next is a huge negative number. Level of production is not just slowing down, it has actually decreased from one year to the next. Likewise for our employment numbers. Employment numbers are again in the negative range over here. So it's showing you that employment actually contracted by almost 6 to 8%. Percentage changes are something that are very useful, and we'll be calculating these a lot because percentage changes really emphasize the significance of the event that we are talking about. Sometimes in absolute numbers, your data is showing you a decline of $1 billion. Might not seem a lot for a huge economy, but in terms of percentage changes, that could be a significant number. Overall, you can still see the cyclical activity in the short run. We have periods of expansions and then periods of recessions in our business cycle. The biggest pain of a recession is the effect on the number of employed, or rather the number of unemployed. A recession will dramatically increase the number of your unemployed people and therefore increase your unemployment rate. Now, unemployment not just causes economic job losses, it also has a lot of social and political impact on the economy. And that's why governments do not want your employment numbers to keep on rising. And therefore, they would want to step in and tame the business cycle. Taming the business cycle or stabilizing the business cycle brings us back to our story about Keynesian economics, where we want now government to step in terms of some stabilization policy. We talked about one of these type of stabilization policies earlier, which was your fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is traditionally what was propagated by Keynes. This is when you want the government to step in by increasing its government spending, reducing taxes, or increase social security payments to the public. So this is expansionary fiscal policy, and this is when economy was tanking. Another relatively more recent stabilization policy is that of monetary policy. Monetary policy is when your central bank steps in and creates this demand for goods and services. How does the central bank motivates people to spend more money? This is when the central bank increases money supply and brings down the interest rates. Interest rates, remember, are cost of borrowing. So when your cost of borrowing is lower, households will borrow more and increase their spending. Firms will borrow more and increase their spending. So monetary, as the name suggests, is coming through changes in money supply and interest rates. And fiscal policy is going to be when the change or the stabilization comes through your treasury benches, through government spending, taxes, and transfers. These two policies are going to be discussed in a lot more detail in later chapters. For now, you should remember what is monetary policy and what is fiscal policy, and make sure you do not confuse the two. Another major concern for macroeconomists is long-term economic growth. Long-term economic growth refers to increases in your standards of living. And this is a long-run phenomena, so we will not be looking at quarterly or yearly data, but rather data over many decades. Now remember, long-run economic growth is more of a modern invention. If we go back in time, for thousands of years, our standards of living were not changing. People in the 15th century were all living the same way as people in the 17th or the early 18th century. There were no major improvements in technology. There was no industrialization, very gradual increases in mechanization of different production processes. For thousands of years, standards of living were pretty stagnant. So here we have data for UK and Canada. And for UK, you can see the data goes back all the way to medieval times. And you can see across centuries over here, there's hardly any change in the standards of living for an average individual. And you see significant changes happening in the standards of living only after the early 19th century. Now, what is standard of living, or what is long-term growth? The data we are using over here is called GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is your production per person. If I divide my total output produced by the economy by its population, this gives us what we call GDP per capita, or GDP per person, or output per person. This is a measure of, on average, how much each person earns in this economy. So we're not now looking just at the size of the pie, but we're dividing the pie equally across all individuals in this economy. And we're looking at what is the average share of the pie that you get. If on average, your share of the pie is getting bigger, then your standards of living are improving. If on average, your share of the pie remains stagnant over time, then standards of living are not changing. If your standards of living start to deteriorate, then your share of the pie is actually becoming smaller. This is a major topic of concern for macroeconomists, and a lot of macroeconomic literature is devoted to just this subject. We will briefly touch upon this later in the course, but for now, remember, long-term growth is always in terms of the size of your share of the pie, and we define it as increases in our GDP per capita in the long run. Another thing to remember over here is that, remember the short-run alternations in our GDP that we saw earlier? They have been completely dwarfed out once we look at our long-term data. So short-run cyclical movements in your GDP have no effect on your long-term growth. The third major concern for macroeconomists is inflation and deflation. So inflation is simply increase in our price level. So now remember, we are looking at the aggregate economy. So we are not concerned with the price of apples or houses or gasoline alone. We are looking at some aggregate price level, and we'll denote it as our uppercase P. So when this average price level of the economy or aggregate price level of the economy starts to rise, we call it inflation. Deflation occurs when this aggregate price level, some average level of prices in your economy, starts to go down. Inflation rate is the percentage change in this aggregate price level. Note, if price level is falling, your inflation rate will actually become negative. So when prices are rising, your inflation rate will be positive. If prices are actually falling in the new time period, if you have lower price than the previous time period, because of deflation, you will get a negative number over here. So deflation is when your inflation rate is negative. A major goal of policymakers today is price stability, especially of your monetary policymakers. What do I mean by price stability? Price stability does not mean that we do not want prices to change. Prices in a free market economy give us signals about scarcity of resources. So we do not want prices to not change. Prices are always going to change for various goods and services. The idea over here is that we don't want inflation rate to change too randomly or too sporadically. We do not want the inflation rate to be very volatile. Price stability refers to stable and low inflation. The inflation rate for Canada in the last 10 years is roughly around 2%, and the Bank of Canada tries to keep it between the range of 1 and 3%. Another interesting to note over here is that inflation and the business cycle, this is your short-run alternation between expansion and recessions, typically follow the same trend. Not always, but usually they do. So you can see because of the pandemic, our inflation rate is going down, becoming negative, and our economy is also contracting over here. And whenever you see a rising economy, you will also see a rising inflation rate. Again, if we go back to the global financial crisis of 2009, our economy is contracting and so is your inflation rate. So usually we see inflation and output following the same trend. As of our latest data, we see inflation is actually no longer negative in Canada. It has slightly increased and it's almost close to 0.1%. This is your annual percentage change in the price level. As of August 19, inflation has slightly recovered. It's no longer negative. So that's an indication economy is gradually coming out of this major downturn that we saw because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lastly, a major concern for macroeconomists is international imbalances. And what do we mean by international imbalances? This is when we are trading with the rest of the world. How much are we earning versus how much we are spending on foreign goods and services? So an open economy is an economy that trades with the rest of the world. A closed economy, in contrast, would be an economy that does not trade with the rest of the world. Now, in terms of international imbalances, a trade balance is simply looking at the difference in your exports minus imports. Exports are goods and services that you're selling to foreigners and earning money or cash against that. Imports are when you are buying foreign produced goods and services and spending money on these goods, so money flows out of your economy. So this trade balance can be zero, it can be positive or negative. When it is positive, we call it a trade surplus. So trade surplus is when what you're earning from selling goods and services to foreigners exceeds what you're spending on foreign goods and services. So when exports exceeds your imports. What would happen if you have a trade deficit? A trade deficit is simply when the opposite happens, when your imports exceed your exports, or the value of goods and services purchased from foreigners exceeds the value of goods and services that you have sold to foreigners. We'll see in chapter 10 that your trade balance is closely tied to our saving and investment decisions in the aggregate. We'll see whenever an economy has investment that exceeds its overall savings, it is running a trade deficit. And the vice versa would be true whenever it runs a trade surplus. So trade surplus will be associated with a situation in which its investment is lower than its overall savings. And what causes this to happen? We'll explore this question in more detail when we do chapter 10 later on in the course. So that's it for today. Remember, today we defined what macroeconomics is, where does it come from, and what are some of its major concerns. So short-run alternations in your economic activity is what generates the business cycle. Then we have your long-term growth, inflation, deflation, and lastly, we just touched upon international imbalances. These are just simply some of the topics that we will be discussing throughout the course. So it will be a good idea to make yourself comfortable with the terminology because we'll be using these terms now throughout the course. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys next time.